Tonight, we revisit a case that became part of British memory. One death recorded and closed without inquiry. One inquest verdict returned long after the burial. One trial that named its victim but never tried her murder. The case of Anne Palmer, née Brooks, begins in Rugeley, Staffordshire, in the years immediately following 1847. Rugeley was a market town of moderate size situated in the English Midlands, lying within the county of Staffordshire, some 15 miles to the east of Stafford itself. The town occupied a position along the Trent and Mersey Canal, which connected it to the commercial networks of central England, and by the mid-1850s, it was also served by the railway lines that had transformed movement and trade across the industrial Midlands. The town's population in this period numbered in the several thousands. It was a community of mixed character, agricultural in its immediate surroundings, connected to the extractive and manufacturing industries of the wider region, and supporting the trades, professional services, and commercial establishments of a functioning provincial market town. The High Street carried the offices, shops and hotels appropriate to such a community. The Talbot Arms Hotel stood as one of the more prominent establishments on the main thoroughfare. A general practitioner of reasonable standing in such a town occupied a recognised and trusted position within that community. His household a known presence in the social life of the neighbourhood. His professional opinion sought in matters of health and accepted without reservation in matters of death. Anne Brooks was born in Staffordshire, most likely in 1826 or thereabouts, though the precise date has not been established in any surviving documentary record. She was born outside of wedlock. Her mother was Mary Thornton, recorded in various parish documents also as Mary Brooks or Mary Ann Thornton, a woman of modest circumstances who held what the subsequent investigation described as an annuity, a form of regular periodic income. No father is named in any document that has been recovered, and Anne's illegitimate status was noted consistently in the Victorian press and court accounts produced after her death. The circumstances of her upbringing, the conditions of the household in which she spent her childhood, and the specifics of whatever education she received are not recoverable from the surviving historical material. She appears in the documentary evidence as a young woman living in or near Rugeley in the mid-1840s when she came to the attention of a young surgeon who had recently returned to the town. William Palmer was born in Rugeley on the 6th of August, 1824, the son of Joseph Palmer, a timber merchant of local standing whose estate was reported at approximately £70,000 at the time of his death, which occurred when William was approximately 12 years old. Palmer was placed as an apprentice with a Liverpool wholesale druggist in his later adolescent years, an arrangement through which he acquired a practical familiarity with pharmacological substances and their preparation and effects. He left that position under circumstances noted by later investigators as involving irregularities with the employer's accounts, though no prosecution followed at the time. He subsequently trained as an apprentice surgeon at Stafford Infirmary and then pursued his formal medical education at St Bartholomew's Hospital in London, one of the principal teaching hospitals in the country. He qualified as a member of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1846 and returned to Rugeley to establish a general practice. His position in the town was that of a qualified medical man with local roots, and he was known among his neighbours and associates as a sociable, plausible and agreeable man of professional respectability. Anne Brooks and William Palmer were married on the 7th of October 1847 at St Augustine's Parish Church, Rugeley, Staffordshire. Anne was approximately 19 or 20 years of age at the time of the marriage. The union placed her within a household that presented the exterior appearance appropriate to the wife of a country doctor, a comfortable domestic establishment on the main street of the town, a recognisable social position within the community, and a connection to a man whose professional standing was accepted without question by his neighbours. Her own origins, including the fact of her illegitimacy and her mother's modest circumstances, receded into the social identity of a doctor's wife. She was a woman whose standing was now defined principally by her marriage, in the manner that mid-Victorian convention prescribed for women of her circumstances and position. If you find value in histories preserved through court records, testimony, and verified documents, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now back to the record. Mary Thornton, Anne's mother, came to reside at the Palmer household in Rugeley following the marriage of her daughter. She died there in January of 1849, approximately 15 months after the wedding. No investigation was conducted into her death at the time. Mary Thornton held an annuity that provided her with a degree of financial independence, and William Palmer had a financial interest in the circumstances surrounding her life and death, whether through direct insurance arrangements on her life or through the cessation of her income and its effect on household finances. The precise nature of that financial arrangement became a matter of retrospective inquiry only when the broader pattern of deaths associated with the Palmer household was examined by the authorities in 1855 and 1856. No question was raised in January of 1849. Between 1849 and 1854, Anne and William Palmer produced a number of children. 4 or 5 of these children died in infancy, each death attributed at the time to convulsions or to a similar complaint recognised in the period as a natural cause of infant mortality. Post-mortem examinations were not conducted on the infants. The deaths were registered, the children were buried, and the record in each case was closed. Only one son, William Brooks Palmer, survived to adulthood. The serial loss of children in the Palmer household was not, in the England of the 1850s, a circumstance that automatically prompted formal inquiry. Infant mortality throughout the country remained at levels sufficient to sustain the attribution of multiple infant deaths to natural causes within a single household, and the diagnosis of convulsions carried no particular burden of proof. What would later be established when the pattern was retrospectively examined in 1855 and 1856 is that the clinical presentations of these deaths were consistent with the administration of toxic substances. No formal determination was made regarding any individual infant's death, and none was ever sought. The financial circumstances of the Palmer household in the early 1850s differed substantially from the outward appearance it presented to the world. Palmer's involvement in horse racing had been sustained and costly. He owned racehorses, attended meetings across the Midlands and the north of England, and placed bets in sums that had accumulated, by the early 1850s, into debts estimated at tens of thousands of pounds. He had raised money by forging his mother's name on bills of exchange, drawing on her financial standing without her consent or knowledge. He had borrowed from moneylenders and from associates on terms that the income of a country medical practice could not sustain. He had, in short, constructed a facade of professional respectability over a financial position that was in acute and accelerating crisis. The reality of his debt was not visible to those outside his immediate affairs, and the household in Rugeley continued to present itself as a comfortable professional establishment. It was in this context that William Palmer took out life insurance policies on the life of his wife, Anne, in 1853 and 1854. The aggregate value of the policies is consistently recorded in the documentation that emerged from the subsequent proceedings at approximately £13,000, distributed across several different assurance companies. This figure represented a sum many times greater than the annual income of a country general practitioner. The policies had been arranged over a relatively short period in the months before Anne's death. The regulation of life insurance in England in this period was limited, and the transaction of insuring a spouse's life was not an arrangement that the assurance companies treated as inherently suspicious at the time the policies were issued. They were in place by the time Anne became ill in the autumn of 1854. Anne Palmer was reported in the accounts that emerged from the later proceedings to have been in reasonable health before the events of September 1854. She was approximately 27 years of age. She had borne multiple children, had suffered the loss of the majority of them, and continued to manage the household and to care for the surviving son in the domestic routines of a professional man's wife in a provincial market town. No document survives in which Anne described her own state of health or her circumstances. Her daily life, her private experience of the household she occupied, and whatever knowledge or suspicion she may or may not have possessed regarding her husband's affairs are not recoverable from the surviving material. Her presence in the historical record in the period before September 1854 exists almost entirely through her relationship to her husband and through the evidence produced after her death. In September of 1854, Anne Palmer became acutely ill. The onset was rapid. She suffered severe gastric symptoms, including persistent vomiting and abdominal distress, and her physical condition deteriorated over the course of several days. William Palmer attended her in the capacity of her physician. No independent medical practitioner is documented as having been consulted or summoned to provide a second opinion on her condition. Her husband occupied simultaneously the role of spouse and attending doctor, and the management of her illness proceeded without external medical oversight of any kind. Anne Palmer died on the 29th of September, 1854, at the Palmer household in Rugeley, Staffordshire. She was approximately 27 years of age. The cause of death was recorded as English cholera, also described in the period as gastric fever. Cholera had visited English towns with regularity throughout the preceding decade, producing fatalities that presented with severe gastric distress, and the diagnosis could be applied to the pattern of Anne's symptoms with sufficient plausibility to satisfy the requirements of the death certificate. William Palmer certified or arranged the certification of his wife's death. No post-mortem examination was conducted. The body of Anne Palmer was interred in the churchyard. William Palmer subsequently presented claims to the assurance companies that held the policies on his wife's life. The companies paid. No objection was raised, and no authority initiated an inquiry into the circumstances of the death. The official record of Anne Palmer closed on the 29th of September, 1854, with the registered cause of cholera and the matter treated as concluded. The Palmer household had now recorded, within approximately 6 years, the deaths of Anne's mother, the majority of Anne's children, and Anne herself. None had generated a criminal investigation. None had produced a post-mortem examination. The combination of William Palmer's position as a qualified medical man, his authority as attending physician in each case, and the availability of medically plausible, natural explanations for each death, had permitted the record to close without formal scrutiny in every instance. The deaths would remain unchallenged in the official record until events in November of 1855 caused the entire history of the household to be brought to the attention of the authorities. John Parsons Cook was a young sportsman and racing associate of William Palmer's, a man of independent means, who had attended the Shrewsbury races in the second week of November 1855. Cook won a substantial sum on a horse named Polestar at those meetings, a prize reported at approximately £800, and by some accounts somewhat more. William Palmer was present at the Shrewsbury races. Cook had a financial relationship with Palmer that included, though its details were not fully established until the investigation that followed, the existence of forged documents bearing Cook's name and the entanglement of Cook's winnings in Palmer's own financial dealings. Cook began to feel unwell almost immediately following the Shrewsbury races. The onset of his illness was noted by those present at the time, and Palmer remained in close attendance. Cook was brought from Shrewsbury to Rugeley and installed at the Talbot Arms Hotel, the commercial establishment on the main thoroughfare of the town, situated directly opposite the Palmer household. Palmer visited him repeatedly during the days that followed. Dr. Benjamin Bamford, an elderly local physician, was also in attendance and accepted Palmer's account of Cook's condition and its management. Cook's symptoms deteriorated over the following days with rapid and alarming progression. He suffered violent convulsions and a rigid arching of the body that locked his spine and limbs in a state of acute muscular spasm. His jaw was clenched. The convulsive episodes occurred in succession. Those present at the Talbot Arms during Cook's final hours described scenes of extreme physical distress, and the attending physicians noted the clinical presentation at the time. John Parsons Cook died on the 21st of November, 1855, at the Talbot Arms Hotel in Rugeley. He was a young man, and his death, following so rapid an illness with so violent a presentation, was noted by those who had witnessed it. The prize money Cook had won at Shrewsbury could not be accounted for after his death. Financial documents bearing Cook's name, which examination would later show to have been forged, were in Palmer's possession. Palmer had, in the days preceding Cook's death, visited a local chemist in Rugeley and purchased strychnine and other substances. These purchases were recorded, and the chemist's records were available to subsequent investigation. William Vernon Stevens, Cook's stepfather, was dissatisfied with the account of events presented to him following Cook's death. Stevens was not a man without resources or determination. He engaged a solicitor to represent his interests, and communication was initiated with the Home Office, the government department responsible for criminal justice and internal affairs, regarding the circumstances of Cook's death. Stevens' intervention was the act that initiated the formal investigation into William Palmer. A post-mortem examination of John Parsons Cook's body was conducted. The examining physician was Dr. John Harland. William Palmer was present at the examination. Those who observed Palmer's conduct during the post-mortem noted his unusual attention to the handling of Cook's stomach contents. The stomach and its contents were removed and sealed for transmission to London for toxicological analysis. Palmer was reported, in accounts gathered by investigators, to have positioned himself close to the proceedings in a manner that attracted notice, and to have made remarks that observers recorded in their subsequent statements to the authorities. The stomach contents of John Parsons Cook were sent to Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor, Professor of Chemistry and Medical Jurisprudence at Guy's Hospital, London. Taylor was the foremost forensic toxicologist in England at this period, the author of the standard professional reference on poisons in their relation to medical jurisprudence and medicine, and a figure of considerable standing in the medico-legal world. The analysis he conducted on Cook's stomach contents would become central to what followed. The investigation was formally opened following the receipt of Stevens' communication and the initiation of the coroner's proceedings. Officers acting under the direction of the investigating authorities gathered statements from those who had been present at the Shrewsbury races, from those who had attended Cook at the Talbot Arms, from the chemists in Rugeley who had supplied substances to Palmer, and from the financial parties who had dealings with Palmer in the period before and after Cook's death. The inquiry extended into Palmer's financial affairs and into the documentation connected to Cook's winnings and to the bills and instruments that bore Cook's name. Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor's toxicological report on Cook's stomach contents found antimony, a metallic substance used in small quantities as a medicinal compound in the Victorian period, present in Cook's remains. Antimony, in larger quantities, produces severe gastric illness and cumulative organ damage. Taylor, however, could not chemically isolate strychnine from the stomach contents submitted to him, despite the clinical presentation of Cook's final hours being, in his professional judgment and in the judgment of other medical witnesses who reviewed the evidence, wholly consistent with strychnine poisoning. Strychnine administered in sufficient quantity produces exactly the pattern of violent muscular convulsions, rigid spasm, and locked jaw that those present at the Talbot Arms had witnessed and described. The limitation was not clinical, but analytical. The chemistry of the period had not yet developed methods capable of isolating strychnine from stomach contents with reliable certainty. Taylor stated in his findings that the symptoms observed in Cook's final hours were consistent with strychnine poisoning, and that no natural disease with which he was familiar could account for the clinical presentation as described by witnesses. His inability to produce the compound chemically, however, provided a significant point of contention that would define the subsequent trial. The investigation into Cook's death had by this point brought the household of William Palmer in Rugeley under sustained examination. The broader pattern of deaths associated with Palmer and his household was now visible to the investigating authorities in a way that it had not been to anyone examining any individual death in isolation. The deaths of Anne Palmer, of Mary Thornton, of the Palmer infants, and of Cook were now considered together, and the picture that emerged from that consideration was one that demanded further inquiry. Authority was obtained for the exhumation of Anne Palmer's body. The exhumation was conducted in December of 1855, more than a year after Anne's death. Her remains were removed from the churchyard and submitted to examination. The toxicological analysis of Anne Palmer's exhumed remains found antimony present in significant quantities. Antimony is a substance that deposits in bone and soft tissue and persists after death in a manner that renders it detectable long after burial, a property that distinguished it from other toxic agents more commonly associated with the period, and that made the finding possible despite the interval since Anne's death. The presence of antimony in Anne Palmer's remains was established by toxicological analysis to the satisfaction of the examining authorities. The finding provided the foundation for formal proceedings regarding Anne's death. A coroner's inquest was convened at Rugeley, Staffordshire, following the results of the exhumation and toxicological analysis. The proceedings were held before the coroner, and testimony was taken under oath from those with relevant knowledge of the circumstances of Anne's illness and death, from the medical witnesses who had examined her remains, and from the toxicologists who had conducted the analysis. The inquest jury heard the evidence regarding the antimony finding, the circumstances of the life insurance policies, the absence of any post-mortem examination at the time of Anne's death in 1854, and the original registration of the cause of death as cholera. The inquest jury returned a verdict of willful murder against William Palmer. The formal legal finding was that Anne Palmer had been murdered. The verdict was entered in the record. Palmer had also been the subject of a coroner's inquest finding of willful murder in connection with the death of John Parsons Cook. William Palmer was arrested in December of 1855. He was taken into custody and remanded to await the proceedings that would follow. His conduct in custody was described by those who dealt with him as calm, self-possessed, and, in the estimation of observers, unusual in its composure for a man in his position. He denied the accusations against him. He maintained that Cook had died of natural causes and that the toxicological findings were the result of error or contamination. His bearing in the days and weeks following his arrest was consistent with the character attributed to him by those who had known him in Rugeley: sociable, self-assured, and careful in his manner. The prosecuting authorities considered which charge to bring to trial. 2 inquest verdicts of willful murder had been returned against Palmer, one for Anne and one for Cook. The prosecution elected to proceed first and only on the charge relating to Cook's murder. The evidence in Cook's case, while it turned on the contested question of the strychnine analysis, presented the stronger, cumulative, evidential basis for a jury. The purchase of strychnine from the Rugeley chemist was documented. The clinical evidence of strychnine poisoning, while not confirmed by chemical isolation, was supported by multiple medical witnesses. The financial motive, the forged documents, the disappearance of the race winnings, and Palmer's continuous access to Cook during his final illness combined to form a body of circumstantial evidence that the prosecution judged capable of sustaining a conviction. The murder of Anne Palmer, though the inquest had returned a formal verdict of willful murder against her husband, was not brought before a court. It was not among the charges on which Palmer was committed for trial. The verdict of the inquest sat in the record, but no trial followed from it. Anne Palmer had been found, by the formal legal process of a coroner's inquest, to have been murdered. The man against whom that verdict was returned was never asked to answer for her death in a court of law. The decision to try Palmer at the Old Bailey in London rather than in Staffordshire presented a procedural question of some significance. The case had attracted press coverage of national reach and intensity throughout the autumn and winter of 1855 and 1856. The population of Staffordshire had been reading about the deaths at Rugeley for months, and the question of whether a jury drawn from that county could deliberate without the influence of prior opinion was raised by the authorities. The response was the passage of the Central Criminal Court Act of 1856, which came to be known in the press and subsequently in legal history as Palmer's Act. The Act permitted the transfer of a trial from its natural county jurisdiction to the Central Criminal Court in London, on the grounds that local prejudice had rendered a fair trial in the original jurisdiction impossible. The transfer of Palmer's trial from Staffordshire to London was the first and for many years the only occasion on which this provision had been invoked in English legal history. The trial was set to commence at the Old Bailey in the spring of 1856. The trial of William Palmer commenced at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, London, on the 14th of May, 1856. The presiding judges were Lord Chief Justice Sir John Campbell, assisted by Mr. Justice Alderson and Mr. Justice Sir Samuel Martin. The charge before the court was the murder of John Parsons Cook on the 21st of November, 1855. The murder of Anne Palmer was not before the court, and no evidence regarding Anne's death was presented as a formal matter of the prosecution's case against her husband. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General, Sir Alexander Cockburn, one of the senior law officers of the Crown, and a barrister whose reputation at the Victorian bar was already considerable. Cockburn's closing address to the jury would, in the estimation of contemporaries, rank among the outstanding achievements of Victorian forensic advocacy and contribute to the distinction that later brought him to the position of Lord Chief Justice. The defence was led by Sergeant William Shee. Palmer entered a plea of not guilty. He was observed throughout the proceedings by those in court and by the press in attendance. The trial attracted an extraordinary degree of public and press interest. The Times carried verbatim daily reports of the proceedings from the opening day. The public gallery was filled throughout the 12 days of the trial. Special seats were sought in advance of each session, and the newspaper correspondence and editorial commentary that accompanied the daily reports reflected the degree to which the case had become an event of national attention in a way that had rarely been matched by any previous criminal proceeding in England. The prosecution presented its case across multiple days of evidence. The central elements of the prosecution's case were the following. Palmer had purchased strychnine from a chemist in Rugeley in the days immediately before Cook's death. This purchase was documented in the chemist's records and attested to by the chemist himself in testimony. Palmer had continuous access to Cook during his final illness at the Talbot Arms Hotel, visiting him repeatedly and handling his food and drink. The symptoms of Cook's final hours, as described in testimony by those who had been present, were consistent with strychnine poisoning, and in the opinion of multiple medical witnesses called by the prosecution, inconsistent with any natural disease capable of producing the clinical picture observed. Palmer had purchased antimony as well as strychnine, and antimony had been found in Cook's body. The race winnings Cook had received at Shrewsbury had disappeared. Financial instruments bearing Cook's name had been forged. Palmer's debts were such that the recovery of Cook's winnings and the cancellation of obligations Cook held against him represented a significant financial motive for Cook's death. The prosecution called a series of medical witnesses to address the question of the cause of Cook's death. Each was asked to consider the clinical presentation observed in Cook's final hours, the violent convulsive episodes, the rigid spasm, and the locked jaw. Each was asked whether that presentation was consistent with strychnine poisoning, and each was asked whether it was consistent with any natural disease. The medical witnesses called by the prosecution gave evidence that the clinical picture was entirely consistent with strychnine poisoning and that they could identify no natural disease that would produce the specific combination of symptoms observed. The testimony was detailed and was subjected to sustained cross-examination by the defence. Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor gave evidence for the prosecution. Taylor had been the principal toxicologist engaged to analyse Cook's remains, and he presented to the court the findings of his examination. He confirmed the presence of antimony in Cook's body. He stated that the clinical presentation of Cook's final illness was, in his professional judgment, consistent with strychnine poisoning, and that the symptoms as described were not consistent with natural disease. He then addressed directly the central analytical problem of the case. He had been unable to chemically isolate a strychnine from the stomach contents that had been submitted to him. The methods available to toxicological science in England in 1856 did not permit the reliable chemical isolation of strychnine from organic material in all circumstances. Taylor stated this plainly, acknowledged the limitation, and maintained nonetheless that his clinical assessment of the cause of death was strychnine poisoning. The defence seized upon this admission as the foundation of its case. Sergeant Shee argued to the jury that no man could be convicted of poisoning by a specific substance when the foremost toxicologist in England had examined the dead man's stomach and could not find that substance in it. The defence contended that Cook had died of a natural disease, possibly tetanus, which could produce convulsions and muscular rigidity in some presentations. The defence called its own medical witnesses, who gave evidence that natural disease could not be excluded as the cause of death. The absence of chemical proof, the defence maintained, was not a gap in the analytical method, but an indication that the substance said to have been used had not in fact been present. The prosecution countered the defence's arguments through the testimony of further medical witnesses who addressed the tetanus argument directly. Tetanus, the prosecution's witnesses explained, produced a slower onset and a different clinical course than the episodes observed in Cook's final hours. The pattern of convulsive attacks, their speed of onset, their severity, and their clinical character, as described by those present at the Talbot Arms, were not consistent with tetanus. Multiple witnesses gave evidence to this effect. Cockburn, in his summation to the jury, addressed the strychnine question at length. He argued that the law did not require chemical proof of a specific poison when the clinical evidence was overwhelming and uncontested in its direction, and that the jury was entitled to accept the evidence of medical witnesses who had described with consistency what strychnine poisoning produces and had identified exactly those characteristics in Cook's death. The 12 days of proceedings included the cross-examination of witnesses from both sides, the presentation of financial evidence regarding Palmer's debts and his dealings with Cook, the evidence of the chemist regarding the strychnine purchase, and the evidence of those who'd been present at Cook's final hours. The press reported the daily testimony in full. The public gallery maintained its attendance. The judges presided over proceedings of unusual length for the period and managed the competing medical testimonies with the procedural framework of the court. The jury retired to deliberate at the conclusion of the closing addresses. After a period of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict on the 27th of May, 1856. The verdict was guilty of the murder of John Parsons Cook. Palmer, when asked if he had anything to say before sentence was passed, replied that he was not guilty. He maintained his innocence. The declaration was noted and recorded. The court proceeded to sentencing. Lord Chief Justice Campbell addressed the prisoner before pronouncing sentence. His remarks, preserved in the trial record, emphasised the deliberate and calculating nature of the crime, the abuse of the trust that attached to medical knowledge and professional standing, and the certainty of the verdict that the jury had returned. The sentence was death by hanging. The verdict was entered in the record of the Central Criminal Court. The conviction was the outcome of 12 days of proceedings that had required the court to address questions of forensic toxicology, medical evidence, and circumstantial proof at a level of sustained complexity that had not previously been seen in an English criminal trial. The prosecution's success in persuading the jury that clinical evidence could establish the fact of poisoning, even in the absence of chemical isolation of the specific compound, was itself a development of consequence in the law's understanding of expert testimony. Palmer was returned from London to Staffordshire to await execution. The sentence was to be carried out at Stafford County Jail, Stafford, in the manner of a public hanging, as the law then required. Public executions remained the practice of English law until 1868, and the execution of a prisoner of Palmer's notoriety was an event that attracted the attention of the press, the public, and those with interests ranging from commercial curiosity to reformist concern about the manner in which the state carried out its most final act. The execution was set for the 14th of June, 1856. In the days before the execution, Palmer received the last rites and was attended by a Roman Catholic priest, a circumstance noted in the press accounts of his final days. He made no public confession, and he did not depart from his declaration of innocence. His conduct in the period between his conviction and his execution was described by those who dealt with him as composed and unremarkable in its bearing, consistent with the character that contemporaries had attributed to him throughout the proceedings. The crowd that assembled outside Stafford County Jail on the morning of the 14th of June, 1856, was estimated by contemporary newspaper accounts at between 30,000 and 50,000 persons. Special railway excursions had been advertised in the preceding days, and observers arrived from across Staffordshire and from farther afield. The scene outside the jail gates was described in the press as combining the solemnity of a public execution with the commercial and social character of a popular gathering. Food sellers, pamphlet hawkers, and itinerant entertainers occupied the approaches to the jail, and the crowd that assembled in the early morning hours was dense and loud. The executioner was William Calcraft, who held the office of Public Executioner of England from 1829 to 1874. Calcraft employed a short length of rope in his executions, a method that did not produce the instantaneous death by broken neck that a longer drop could achieve. Death under Calcraft's method came by strangulation and could extend over a period of some minutes. The reform of execution method was in 1856 a matter that had been raised by critics of public execution over a number of years and had not yet been addressed in law or practice. William Palmer was brought to the scaffold before the assembled crowd on the morning of the 14th of June, 1856, and was executed by hanging. He made no final statement to the crowd. He was buried within the precincts of Stafford Jail, as was the customary practice for convicted murderers executed under English law. Among those who attended the execution was Charles Dickens. Dickens had previously attended the public execution of the Mannings in 1849 and had formed a settled opposition to the practice of public execution on the grounds of its effect on the crowd and the degraded character of the spectacle it produced. He attended Palmer's execution and published a letter in the Times shortly afterwards, describing what he had observed outside the jail gates and arguing, in terms consistent with his earlier published views, for the abolition of public execution as a legal practice. Dickens's published response to the Palmer execution became part of the broader public record of that event, and his advocacy on the question of public execution contributed to the movement that culminated in the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868, which ended public executions in England and Wales. The verdict had been entered. The sentence had been carried out on the 14th of June, 1856. The inquest into Anne Palmer's death had returned a verdict of wilful murder against William Palmer, and that verdict remained in the record. No trial had been held for Anne's murder. No prosecution had been brought for it. The inquest had said murder, and the court had said nothing on the matter. William Palmer had been convicted and executed for the murder of John Parsons Cook, and the record of what had been done to Anne Palmer in September of 1854 remained where it had always been. In the inquest papers, in the toxicology reports, and in the coroner's finding that had led nowhere. The national press had followed the proceedings at the Old Bailey across 12 days of verbatim coverage, and the verdict returned on the 27th of May, 1856, was received with a response proportionate to the attention the case had commanded. The Times had carried daily reports throughout the trial, setting out the testimony of each witness in sufficient detail that readers across England were, by the conclusion of proceedings, familiar with the names of the medical witnesses, the disputed chemistry of strychnine, and the financial history of the prisoner. Regional newspapers, including the Staffordshire Advertiser, had provided sustained coverage of the case from the death of John Parsons Cook in November of 1855 through the arrest, committal, and trial. The Illustrated London News and the Penny Press produced illustrated summaries and sensationalist accounts aimed at the widest possible readership. Broadside ballads commemorating the case were printed and distributed within days of the verdict, sold by street hawkers in London and in the towns of the Midlands. Their verses setting out the charges against Palmer in the compressed and moralistic idiom of the popular print tradition. The commercial appetite for material connected to the case was considerable. Pamphlets summarising the trial were published and sold in editions of significant size. Illustrated accounts of Cook's death and of the Old Bailey proceedings were produced for a readership that had followed the case through the newspapers and wished for a collected narrative. The popular print market that surrounded major criminal trials in mid-Victorian England was extensive and well supplied, and the Palmer case provided it with material of unusual richness: a doctor, a poisoner, a series of deaths extending over years, a forensic controversy, and a 12-day trial that had been covered with unprecedented completeness by the national press. The execution on the 14th of June drew its crowd and its press attention in equal measure. The newspaper accounts of the morning described the assembly outside Stafford Jail in terms that captured both the scale of the gathering and the character of the scene. The crowd was estimated at between 30,000 and 50,000 persons. Those who had travelled by the special railway excursions from Birmingham, Wolverhampton, and the towns of the Midlands arrived in Stafford in the early hours and took their positions as the light came up. The scene was described by reporters as combining the solemnity of a public execution with the commercial activity that such gatherings attracted. Vendors of food and drink, sellers of printed accounts of the case, and hawkers of commemorative material moved through the crowd in the hours before the execution. Dickens's published response, appearing in the Times in the days following the execution, described what he had witnessed with the controlled precision of a man who had attended such events before and had formed his view of what they demonstrated about the moral condition of a crowd assembled to watch a man die. The town of Rugeley had lived for the better part of a year under the weight of its association with the case. The investigation, the arrest, the committal, and the trial had kept the name of the town before the national press throughout that period, and the reputational consequence of being the place where William Palmer had practiced medicine, poisoned his wife, and murdered his associate at the hotel on the High Street was one that the inhabitants of Rugeley felt in practical terms. Commerce, local standing, and the general character of the town's reputation had been affected by the sustained national attention the case had brought. Following the trial and execution, the story was preserved in the accounts of the period that Rugeley's townspeople had petitioned the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, for permission to rename the town. So severe was the damage to its reputation. The story goes that Palmerston replied he would agree to the renaming on one condition: that the town take his own name, Palmerston. As his name contained the name of Palmer entire, this was a condition that defeated the petition's purpose. Whether the exchange took place in precisely these terms, or in what form any communication between the petitioners and the Prime Minister occurred, the primary documentary basis for the account has not been established in the sources available. It has been cited in serious accounts of the case for more than a century and a half, and it is repeated here in the form in which it has come down to the record, as an anecdote, not as a confirmed transaction. The case entered the published record in the years and decades that followed. The volume devoted to the Palmer trial in the notable British Trials series, edited by Eric R. Watson and published by Hodge & Company in 1912, remains the standard scholarly reference for the case and contains the full trial transcript together with documentary apparatus covering the inquest proceedings, the toxicological reports, and the surrounding circumstances. The series was designed to provide the legal profession and the interested public with authoritative accounts of the major criminal trials of the English jurisdiction, and the Palmer case was among the first and most significant volumes produced. The transcript it preserved is the primary source from which subsequent historical and forensic accounts of the case have been drawn, and it remains in print in facsimile edition. The case attracted the attention of writers working in the tradition of Victorian and Edwardian crime biography. Robert Graves, whose work in this period encompassed both fiction and historical non-fiction, produced a treatment of the Palmer case that contributed to the general reader's access to the material in the 20th century. The case was also the subject of a television dramatisation, the specific details of which have been referenced in the secondary literature as a significant adaptation in the case's 20th century cultural presence. The Palmer case stood, in the century following the execution, as one of the small number of Victorian murders that had never left either the popular imagination or the scholarly record. The case's persistence in cultural memory derived from several intersecting properties. It was a case of serial suspected murder, extending over years, involving a professional man in a position of trust. It was a case in which the victim most personal to the perpetrator, his wife, was never the subject of a trial. It was a case in which the foremost forensic toxicologist in England had been unable to produce chemical proof of the specific poison alleged, and in which a jury had nonetheless returned a conviction. These features gave the case a quality of unresolved complexity that sustained scholarly and popular interest across generations. It was not a case that admitted of a simple summary. Its questions, including the central question of why Anne Palmer's murder was never tried, remained in the record alongside its answers. The legal legacy of the case was concrete and lasting. The Central Criminal Court Act of 1856, designated in legal and popular reference as Palmer's Act, established in English law the principle that a trial could be transferred from its natural county jurisdiction to the Central Criminal Court in London, where the conditions for a fair local trial could not be assured. The Act was invoked on the basis that the saturation of public opinion in Staffordshire by press coverage of the Palmer investigation had rendered impartial jury selection in that county impossible. It was the first occasion on which any such transfer had been effected in English legal history, and the principle it established was incorporated into subsequent legislation governing venue transfer in criminal proceedings. The Act stands in legal histories of the English court system as a development of enduring significance, and its origin in the Palmer case is noted wherever the history of venue transfer in English criminal law is discussed. The contribution of the case to the development of forensic toxicology was substantial and is documented in the professional literature of the discipline. Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor's inability to chemically isolate strychnine from Cook's stomach contents had placed the prosecution in the position of relying on clinical evidence to establish a fact that analytical chemistry could not confirm. The resolution of that difficulty, through the acceptance by the jury of medical testimony describing the clinical presentation of strychnine poisoning, was itself a development in the law's relationship to expert scientific evidence. Taylor published revised and expanded editions of his standard professional work on poisons in relation to medical jurisprudence in the years following the trial, and those revisions incorporated the lessons of the strychnine controversy as a matter of professional and analytical consequence. The alkaloid detection methods available to English toxicologists improved in the decades after 1856 in part as a response to the limitations exposed by the Palmer case, and the case is cited in histories of forensic toxicology as a landmark occasion in the development of standards for expert testimony. The case also brought to public and institutional attention the connection between the expansion of life insurance as a financial instrument and the creation of conditions in which murder for insurance proceeds was possible. The regulation of life insurance in England was limited in the early and mid-1850s, and the Palmer case demonstrated, in terms that the press and the public could not fail to observe, that the ability to insure the life of a spouse for a sum far exceeding any plausible financial need represented a structural vulnerability in the system. The subsequent decades saw increasing scrutiny by assurance companies of large policies taken out shortly before claims, and the Palmer case was among the events that shaped that scrutiny. The figure of the educated, professionally established man who used specialised knowledge to commit murder for financial gain had no single origin in the Victorian period, but Palmer was its earliest and most fully realised exemplar in the public record. The pattern of subsequent cases in the Victorian and Edwardian periods, involving medical men and other professional figures whose social authority had shielded their crimes, was repeatedly traced in press coverage and in popular criminal biography back to William Palmer as the type's first prominent instance. The archetype carried his character, sociable and plausible in manner, calculating in method, financially motivated, and enabled in each case by the structural deference that mid-Victorian society extended to professional men. What the record does not contain is Anne Palmer. It contains the documents produced by her death, the death certificate, the inquest proceedings, the exhumation report, the toxicological findings, and the coroner's verdict of willful murder. It contains references to her in the trial of her husband for a different murder. It contains the insurance policies taken out on her life and the claims submitted after her death. It contains a marriage register entry from St Augustine's Parish Church, Rugeley, for the 7th of October 1847, and it contains, somewhere in the parish records of Staffordshire, the burial entries for the children who did not survive infancy in the household she managed on the High Street of Rugeley. What it does not contain is anything in her own voice. No letter, no record of a statement, no testimony given before any proceeding. She did not appear before the coroner's jury that named her murder, because she had been dead for more than a year before that jury sat. She did not appear at the Old Bailey because the Old Bailey was not concerned with her. The investigation that established her murder had begun because a different person, a man, had died in November of 1855 in a hotel across the street from the house where she had lived, and died. Her grave was opened because the investigation required it. The antimony in her bones established what had been done to her. The inquest jury returned its verdict, and then the formal record of her murder stopped. The inquest had returned a verdict of willful murder. No prosecution followed from that verdict. The man against whom it was returned was tried and convicted for another death, and executed and buried within the walls of Stafford Jail. The verdict of the inquest into Anne Palmer's death stood in the record as it had been entered, and the case to which it belonged was not a case that was ever opened in a court. The case of Anne Palmer closes the record examined here. The verdict was entered. The case passed into culture. The record continues to be examined.